Think of a medieval castle feast, and you probably imagine grand lords dining on golden plates and fresh roast venison. But behind the tapestries and music lay a disgusting reality of decay, disease, and slow poisoning. The meat served at these banquets was rarely fresh. It was preserved in piles of dirty, bacteria-laden salt. When salt was scarce, the meat was simply allowed to spoil, turning a sickly green before it ever reached the table. To make matters worse, the food was served on pewter plates containing massive amounts of toxic lead. Acidic foods like tomatoes or vinegar leached the lead directly out of the metal, poisoning the wealthy nobles with every bite. This slow lead poisoning caused severe stomach cramps, brain damage, and extreme irritability among the ruling class. And the wine wasn't any safer. It was often stored in lead-lined vessels to keep it from turning sour. This meant the richest lords, who drank the most wine, were actually poisoning themselves the fastest. Meanwhile, the kitchens where the food was prepared were chaotic, filthy, and crawling with vermin. Rats and mice freely nested in the sacks of flour, leaving feces and urine to be baked directly into the bread. The cooks rarely washed their hands, transferring sweat, dirt, and raw sewage onto the roast meats. To mask the putrid smell and taste of rotting meat, the chefs smothered the dishes in expensive spices. Heaps of ginger, pepper, and cloves were used not for flavor, but as a desperate chemical cover-up. If a dish tasted incredibly spicy, it was a warning sign that the meat underneath had already gone bad. This culinary trick hid the taste, but it did nothing to kill the deadly bacteria multiplying in the flesh. As a result, food poisoning was a constant companion for everyone living inside the castle walls. Violent vomiting and dysentery were so common, they were barely even mentioned in historical records. Even the bread could be a silent killer during wet harvest seasons. Rye grain stored in damp castle vaults frequently grew a toxic black fungus called ergot. Eating this infected rye bread led to a horrific condition known as St. Anthony's fire. Ergotism caused intense burning sensations, gangrene, and eventually caused limbs to rot and fall off. It also triggered vivid, terrifying hallucinations and madness, often mistaken for demonic possession. Entire castle garrisons could be driven mad overnight by a single batch of contaminated bread. But if the fungus didn't get you, the parasites almost certainly would. Because raw sewage was dumped into the castle moat, nearby crops were watered with infected waste. This meant fruits and vegetables grown near the castle were coated in parasite eggs. Almost every noble, including the king, was infested with giant roundworms and tapeworms. These worms grew up to a foot long inside the intestines, stealing nutrients and causing severe wasting. The symptoms were treated with toxic purges, forcing the patient to swallow mercury or liquid lead. These cures damaged the internal organs and often killed the patient faster than the parasites. Fish served at the banquets were harvested directly from the castle moat, which was essentially an open sewer. The fish fed on human waste, absorbing deadly parasites and cholera bacteria. Cooking did not always kill these pathogens, as stoves were primitive and heat was uneven. A single undercooked fish could trigger a cholera outbreak that wiped out half the castle. Water was so dangerous to drink that nobles consumed massive quantities of beer and wine instead. Adults and children drank ale from morning until night just to avoid the contaminated well water. While this kept them hydrated, it meant the entire castle lived in a state of constant, mild intoxication. This constant drinking impaired judgment and led to frequent, violent brawls during banquets. Arguments over minor insults quickly escalated into deadly sword fights right at the dining table. Even the air in the banquet hall was thick with toxic smoke and ash. Without chimneys, smoke from the central hearth drifted freely, burning the eyes and lungs of the guests. Soot settled onto the food, adding a gritty layer of toxic carbon to every dish. Dogs were allowed to roam the hall freely, fighting for scraps and defecating on the straw-covered floor. The straw on the floor was rarely changed, trapping grease, spilled beer, dog waste, and vomit. This mixture rotted over months, creating a foul stench that even the strongest perfumes couldn't mask. Fleas and lice nested in the rotting straw, jumping onto the legs of the dining guests. These insects carried the bubonic plague, turning a festive feast into a death sentence. A noble could go to sleep after a banquet and wake up with painful, swollen buboes in his groin. Yet, despite the filth, the banquets grew larger and more extravagant to show off wealth. Lords competed to serve the most bizarre dishes, like live birds baked inside giant pies. When the pie was cut, the panicked birds flew around the smoky hall, spreading dust and feathers into the food. Guests would laugh and cheer, completely oblivious to the pathogens landing on their plates. After hours of eating and heavy drinking, guests would use a designated room to purge their stomachs. They used feathers to tickle their throats, vomiting up the food so they could return to the feast and eat more. This constant vomiting destroyed their teeth and esophagus, leaving them vulnerable to infections. By the end of the night, the grand hall was a scene of absolute devastation. Nobles passed out in their own vomit, while servants quietly swept away the bones and rats emerged from the shadows. This was the glamorous life of the medieval elite, a slow, self-inflicted cycle of poison, parasites, and rot. The next time you dream of dining like a medieval king, remember the lead plates, the worms, and the toxic feasts.